And before I start the conversation, I just want to let everybody know David Shields is the author of many books of fiction and nonfiction. Most recently, Reality Hunger, a Manifesto. The book that preceded that one is called The Thing About Life is That One Day You'll Be Dead. And this book was partly memoir about his father and being a father to a young daughter, and also about facing mortality. So that's sort of where I thought of the idea for Fatherlode, that David might be a good person to have a discussion with about fatherhood. Last night I looked up the definition of the word motherlode to make sure that I had in mind what that word meant, and this means just sort of a ample supply or a great excess of resources. And I started thinking about, well then, if the motherlode is this, great supply of resource, then what is the fatherlode? Is the fatherlode a scant supply of resources? Is the fatherlode a distant or detached supply of resources? Sort of like, I'm here, but I'm way over there. Anyway, and then I started thinking about how one of the struggles of fatherhood, both David and I are fathers, by the way, is that you have to constantly work against the stereotypes of what a father is, or of the roles of father figures that we have inherited from our fathers. In other words, the notion that, I'm not going to be the distant and detached man. So I'm trying to work against that stereotype in my own relationship with my son, and yet I also find myself trafficking in that stereotype, even this morning. So I guess my first question, or not a question, but maybe something you could talk about, David, is what comes to mind when you think of the word fatherlode as compared to motherlode?
Sure. Thanks, Jay. Fatherlode, I guess I think of a colleague of mine, the poet Heather McHugh, published a book of poems pretty recently called The Father of Our Predicaments, or something like that. I think that's the title of her book of poems, where, to me, the moment you say sort of fatherlode, it seems to me that it kind of puns on the idea of load as burden, the burden of being a father or a son. Like, if motherlode, I guess, implies some notions of an overabundance of resources, somehow the fatherlode seems to imply some idea of what Harold Bloom, the literary critic, called anxiety of influence. How as a son or as a writer, one takes one's father's legacies and tries to remake oneself in the shadow of that burden or that particular load. I guess to vivify that a little bit, a friend of mine, do you guys know the actor Paul Giamatti? Remember from Sideways and from other movies? Anyway, a friend of mine happens to be friends with him. I guess that she went to school with his wife. So anyway, my friend was visiting Paul Giamatti and his wife and their child or children in New York somewhere. And my friend came back to Seattle and said, you, David, remind me so much of Paul Giamatti. And I'm like, thanks a lot. But she said specifically in, I'm a big fan of, if you're going to choose a movie star, Paul Giamatti would not be the movie star one would most want to be compared to, but, it couldn't have been, some glamorous person. But anyway, the point being that she said that specifically how you relate to your daughter reminded me hugely of how Giamatti relates to his daughter. And I said, really? That's fascinating. I'm not even aware of how I relate to my daughter. I just am who I am in relationship to her. And I said, well, gee, tell me what you mean. How do you, who could be fascinated by such an observation? So Jean said that both you and Paul kind of strike the same stance. See if I can describe what Jean said, that basically that she felt like that we both completely empty out the melodrama of the relationship. That I speak to my daughter, according to Jean, that I speak to her, she said, even from a very, very young age, even when Natalie was, say, 1 or 2, I would speak to her as if she were my peer. I would never speak in that god-awful, sing-song voice that parents do, which I'm very proud that I've apparently never have used that, kind of, I don't know what you call it, that sort of super syrupy, sort of Mr. Rogers voice. Does not come to my lips, and I've never spoken like that to anyone. And if I do, I want to slit my wrist. But anyway, she just said that we emptied out the melodrama of the conflict between father and daughter by always sort of speaking in a sort of neutral, ironic, self-mocking, mocking, sort of peer-to-peer conversation. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I just thought that was an interesting way to get into these issues. Some of you might have different parenting techniques. Some of you might find that an appalling approach to my 1.5-year-old daughter to be speaking to her about Proust or whatever. but anyway, I just thought that kind of gets into it, that some of the issues Jay was talking about, that, I don't know quite where else to take it, that I had very different parents probably than most of you, in the sense that when people speak of kind of maternal nourishing or paternal, draconian paternal authority, that just does not jive at all with my parents. That my dad was, sort of manic depressive his entire life, was in and out of mental hospitals his entire life. And my mom was this rather, omnipotent and somewhat frightening figure. So the whole calculus has been recalibrated in my mind. I don't really have a father figure to work against in that traditional way. So I think that the way I've carved out my own paternal role is related to that. But anyway, I'm just sort of babbling. I'll let Jay jump in.
Last night, Amy and I, my wife and I, were talking about this. Actually asked her if she had a question for David. And we were just talking about, because one of the ways I think I reacted against my own father's parenting, and who, I love my father very much, and I don't have a lot to complain about, but he was the provider, and he was busy quite a bit, and he was very serious around the house. I remember him, my brothers and I, watching television. We'd be all sort of passed out on the couch, basically, underneath blankets, watching some strange game show. and my dad would kind of walk through the living or the family room sort of and make a comment about what we were watching, that it was just junk. And just sort of like, he was sort of really busy, and what we were doing was kind of wasting our time. And so as I became a father, I sort of felt, well, geez, I really would like to become, I'm going to watch more television with Oscar. No, I wanted to be less serious, and I wanted to be sillier around him than my own father was. And yet, oddly enough, my father as a grandfather is a very silly person, and I've even caught my dad and Oscar, my son, watching the Weather Channel together. So he's really quite changed, but there is a sense that I felt like I had to work against something that I felt that I never felt really. It's like with my dad acting that way, I didn't feel very good about myself. And so I somehow needed to try and change that up. I'm wondering, David, if you felt, if there's been a conscious choice with your daughter, by the way, who's now 17 or 16?
Nearly 17.
Yeah. If you felt that you've made very different choices in parenting than, say, both your mother and your father.
Yeah. Was there a question that Amy was going to ask?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. We'll get to that.
Okay,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Anyway, go for it.
Okay.
What was the question?
Well, she wanted to know what the ratio was between this, what she calls my fathering, where I'm very soft and silly and very, present with him, and the other kind of fathering that I try to not be, but I can't help but be sometimes, and that's the distracted father, the father who's not entirely present, the father who is in the moment, maybe elsewhere. And so she wanted to know if what the ratio was for both of us in terms of those two roles. And I came up, I was like aspiring. I was like, well, I aspire, of course, to 80-20 at least. But I can't say that I'm 80-20. I mean, I think it's more like 50-50 or 55-45, and it may even be lower. But that was kind of her question, if you struggle with those two, or maybe different kinds of presence, being present in your family situation, and also in relationship to making books, and to writing books, and to reading books. And
right.
Yeah.
I guess the thing I'd want to push back a little bit is the idea that somehow cartoonizing fatherhood is somehow always a pejorative thing. I mean, somehow we're falling into this pattern a little bit of, the motherlode is sort of, oh, that's all the good stuff. Mm-hmm. And fatherhood is somehow the distracted or whatever. I mean, I think there's there's good things to fatherhood too. And I think for me, one of the surprises or one of the complicating things of it for me is seeing, in a way, although, that my daughter calls me by my first name, doesn't call my wife by her first name. And there's all kinds of ways in which I'm sort of, to a certain degree, the emptied out father, sort of father as older brother, or father as kind of nutcase, or whatever. I nevertheless, in many ways, am very much a traditional father in the sense that it's a little surprising to me as Natalie's gotten older. She's now 7. She's a junior in high school, and we're kind of doing all of our college tour stuff of late. So she's a visual artist and graphic artist and web designer and photographer. And we've been taking her around to various design schools around the country to see which ones she thinks that she'd like to apply to. And, there's part of me that's just very sort of boringly ambitious for my daughter. I want her to go to a really good school, and I want her to become a really good graphic designer. And, my wife did not want Natalie to go to a private school. She thought the public school was fine. And I said, no, I'll take on, this extra teaching and lectures and stuff, pay for Natalie's private high school. And so anyway, I guess for me, I'd push back against any too pejorative notion of fatherhood as, distracted per se or anything like that. I mean, obviously there's part of it. I guess for me, I think Jay's a whole generation younger than I am. I think I'm 53. I don't know how old Jay is, like
39.
39. So, almost a generation younger. But, I think that we grew up with unbelievably different fathers, whereby Jay's dad, I think, was he was in, not advertising, but a businessman.
Business, yeah.
Apparently quite a successful businessman, I gather. And, it was kind of like a traditional dad. You grew up in the Midwest in suburban Chicago or Milwaukee?
Around in Indiana.
That's right.
So near Chicago.
Near South Bend or
yeah,
something?
South Bend, yeah.
And, and that I grew up, kind of a secular Jewish family in San Francisco and L.A., and my parents were both journalists, and, that I grew up with a whole different sort of set of circumstances. So to me, father is never kind of the distracted workaholic. It's something totally different. But, is there a question or thought?
I've read the statement. I have a master's in history, and so I look at your regionalism comments as very important. But that if fatherhood is learned by reiteration, both of you have seemed to say it's an effort to not be the silent father and not be the judging father when you're watching the stupid television show. That if children are seeking approval, like you're saying, I hope I'll sit down and watch with Oscar. If everything, whether it's motherhood or fatherhood, if it's not necessarily an effort to do better. You said, I love my father. Your father was silent and a little older. Is there some effort to do a sort of a flip?
Well, there's that.
If we learn it by reiteration, and of course, it's always the model in all art. The baby at the mother's knee is the dominant. They do come from our bodies. So that doesn't, that gives us privy.
Definitely.
Position in the first place.
Well, what's that wonderful line that Barack Obama says a lot? It might be in one of his memoirs, but he says, and Obama acknowledges that it might be too simple, but he says something like, every man is either trying to please his father and earn his father's admiration, or he's trying to make sure that he avoids all of the errors that his father made. Maybe it's a little too simple, but you can see in Obama's case, grew up with a absentee father. His father was abusive. It's becoming increasingly obvious his father was alcoholic. And that so much of Obama's personality is sculpted around, he's hugely invested in not being his father. And you can compare that to other people in public life, George Bush, John McCain. So many people are hugely, and I think for me, I would say, how would each of us respond to that as men vis-a-vis our father? I do think I'm probably pretty invested in, when I think of my father, he actually died a year ago, so at age 98, he was quite an old fellow. But, I'm hugely invested, I think, in avoiding some of the problems that he faced, and so, I don't know, it's sort of an interesting way to think about. I'm curious how Jay would think about that, if he's endlessly invested in trying to earn his father's admiration, or more invested in trying to make sure that he avoids his... Obviously, it's some combination, I think. That's why Obama acknowledges that division is too easy. I think for me, a big issue is in my family, my father was hugely demonized as sort of like the bad way to go. Like one time I was talking to a psychologist once about my life, and I was saying this line that my mother said, and she basically said, if you keep on going like that, you're going to be like your father, which is like a pretty awful thing to say, that, the father was the anti-model in so many ways. And I think part of what I have recovered as a middle-aged person is to see how wonderful my father was. He had an incredible sense of humor, and he had a great love of language and a great love of physicality. He was quite a good athlete in his own way. I mean, even till age 95, he was still playing tennis and golf, and he once had a heart attack on the tennis court and didn't leave the court until his doubles team had won the set. And he was just this like insane physicality to him. And also he was an incredible joke teller, incredible storyteller, great love of language and sort of dumb puns. And I think in our family he was hugely demonized as kind of like, don't be like your father. But I see like in so many ways I am like my father, and in certain ways I'm not. But in some ways part of my middle-age project has been to recover for myself what is and was sort of wonderful about him despite all of his flaws. And I think so much of what I'm interested in myself is my love of language, my love of comedy in my writing, my love of the physical body, of sports, of physicality, of corporeality. I mean, so many of my strengths as a person and as a writer come directly from my father.
Sherry?
Yeah, it would be nice to hear more along those lines in terms of part of what I wanted to do with the Motherlode show was look at motherhood as a source of material, artistic material for women, and also the influence of motherhood as a load, as a burden, that also influences their creative output because it may restrict it in terms of time. It may also, it takes up a whole lot of time to raise children, a whole lot of time that one might think, well, I could be writing, I could be making art. So it's sort of that double burden plus opportunity that I saw women responding to. And I think your book, The Thing About Life is One Day You'll Be Dead, it seems like you wove that part in as well. And have there been like structural parts to your writing life where being a father has changed how much you can write? Has it been created an opportunity to talk about other things besides your own father, which your book reads in, your role as a father? That kind of thing is influencing you as artists. Would be interesting to hear.
Sure. Yeah. Jay, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I did want to, before I think about that out loud, I did want to just think about the Obama assertion that you made. Because I sort of feel like that is happening simultaneously in flashes. I mean, when I'm in the same room with my father, I feel this really huge love for him and this empathy for him, for his ambition as a worker, for his generosity. He's an incredibly generous person, and yet the moment when he calls me and his number pops on the caller ID, I fill with dread. I mean, I'm just, I'm sort of constantly moving in and out of those two.
Dread for what particular reason? What do you dread?
Besides talking to another human being,
Apprehensive?
no, I think there's so many ways in which I've tried to sort of move away from his sort of way of life, or his interest and my interest are very different. We don't share passions per se. And those gaps kind of are amidst these other feelings of love that I have for him, and also these feelings of really wanting to get to know him more as a person. I think it's directly related to having a son and to seeing him with my son, and just the triangulation that occurs with that. But to sort of get to Terry's question, and then maybe I'll hand it over to you, David. I was thinking about how it's definitely having Oscar's 5, and having a 5-year-old has taken up, of course, a lot of time. But I've always also, kept time to be a writer and to be a reader, and I maybe get less sleep here and there. I think the way it's, my writing practice has become a little smaller, and I imagine as he gets a little older, it might expand a little more, contract. But the way having a son has influenced my work mostly is just that, because the kind of work I do, which is essentially essay or nonfiction prose, is sort of I'm always constantly trying to describe what's going on in my inner life. He has become, he's imprinted all over my work. He's inside. I mean, I find myself writing about him. So he's become part of my inner landscape. And sort of as I move that or try to represent that in my work, he is present there constantly, and I've never resisted that. I mean, it would seem unnatural for me to resist him as subject matter. David, do you have a sense?
Sure. Obviously, it's a gigantic question how parenthood or fatherhood has altered one's work or one's writing life. In huge ways, I think. One thing that comes to mind, I think that my work has gotten, Natalie's 17, she was born in 1993, and I don't think it's a coincidence that my work has gotten, in my view, immensely better and immensely more interesting. In my view, I mean, I don't know, other people would judge if my work, if any of the work is interesting. But to me, the work has gotten sort of more emotionally available, emotionally exciting, structurally exciting, just since Natalie's birth. I mean, it's almost tracks almost directly with it. That before that she was born, I wrote 3 relatively traditional works of fiction. And really, almost literally since she was born, I started to work on more nonfiction work that was more emotionally naked, more risk-taking, nervous-making, etc. I mean, in fact, when she was born, I was working on what I thought was my 4th novel, a book called Remote. I thought it was a novel. And then in the year or 2 after she was born, I realized it was actually trying to be and became a work of nonfiction. So it's almost like on some sort of odd level, the literal physical fact of her pushed me into a more non-fictional mode and kind of an immersion in the real in some strange way. I also think structurally that she's had an effect on my work in the sense that one literally has less time, And so, I teach, I have a full-time teaching job at the University of Washington. I try to be, a pretty full-time father. And so that my work ever since Natalie was born has moved very, very strongly in a more collage-like or pointillistic mode. I mean, that my work in the last sort of 15 years has moved completely away from linear, traditional, realistic, plot-based fiction into nonfiction that is almost invariably pointillistic, modular, and collage-like. In some ways, I can sort of give you a big steeple-fingered theory as to why I'm interested in collage, but in a way it might just be the simple fact that I have less time, and so I really love working in small prose passages. I don't think that's the only reason by any means, but I do think that the compression of time has probably pushed me into a more collage-like mode. And I guess it's sort of a cliche, of parenthood is that life seems more serious. It seems it just seems more serious. And I do think that my work has gotten, in a good way, sort of more serious. I feel like, in a way, I look at some of my earlier books, which I'm so proud of, they seem like I'm slightly fooling around a little bit, like sort of hugely invested in a kind of formal architecture, which simply doesn't interest me anymore. And so I think in a variety of ways that Natalie has had an enormous effect on my work, both formally, emotionally, structurally, and trying to make the work really matter, because you're surrounded by this person who seems to matter to you, your daughter, and you say, well, if I'm going to spend time on my work, it can't just be like, okay, I'm going to write one more book that's a pretty good novel. It's like it has to really, 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 really resonate so that it'll be as interesting to me as Natalie is. And so I feel like it's pushed my work into, I think, to me, pretty exciting places, both formally and emotionally, so that it's as interesting to me as Natalie is, which is saying something. Did you have a thought?
You mentioned the movie star, Sam, whatever.
Brad Pitt, the guy thought that I looked a lot like Brad Pitt. Yeah.
There was a movie magazine at least 15 years ago, and it was a movie star. I think it was Liam Nielsen. I'm not sure, because all I remember is this little picture, when you pick up something in the magazine you'd never buy at the doctor's office. And this man was holding this little girl in his hand, a little baby. And his statement was, there was part of me that was born, and me as a man, that can never be born until I looked into the eyes of my own child. Part of me is not born until and I don't know whether that's true of motherhood. Because I don't know if they come from our bodies and we're responsible at the mother's need. And wait till your father gets home. We're old, I'm old, and there are older people that survive as mothers, too. But I wonder, when you mention this emotionalism and this change in your career, what about when mother went to work? Like Kay here, then that time element that you're talking about plays a big role, because the presence of the mother has to be backed up, or is it backed up by this new creature that has come into fatherhood? The story, I want to say the typical Jewish mother. Well, I had a lot of Jewish friends that are not the typical Jewish mother,
Right.
But I'm thinking of that relationship that you're talking about now, about your fathers as adult men and fathers yourself. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Cary Grant was 63 when he fathered his daughter. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a letter that I cut out and put somewhere in my papers about what Betsy had done in his life. And this was a man, now nearly 80, commenting on this one event of how blessed he was.
I was just thinking about how, now, because I am a father, I can't imagine what it would be like to be to not be a father. So it's hard for me to say whether or not, another part of me. I mean, I definitely would say that another part of me has emerged because I have a son, but if I didn't have one, I imagine there would be other parts of me that might emerge, or other selves. I did want to actually kind of check in with Linda, the Motherlode artist, to see if any of this is resonating with you, or if just something has piqued your interest, or as a mother.
Okay, I guess a couple of things are occurring to me. One is the moment where Terry jumped in and sort of asked you to talk more about your writing and less about being a father. I was sitting here with that same kind of tension, sort of, I wonder when they're going to start talking about the writing and less about being a father. And I wondered if it was just that as a mother, it's so easy to shift into talking about my role as a mother, and it's so relatively hard maybe to find opportunities to talk just about our work. And so it's like if I was up there, I would be trying not to talk about motherhood, and I would be trying to talk about my artwork. And so I wonder how maybe that's just different, being fathers as opposed to mothers. So that's the one thing. Well, why don't you answer that, and then I'll remember what the second thing was.
I have a sense. I mean, as I was preparing for this conversation, I don't know how it is for you, David, but I don't know that I have a lot of friends who are fathers, but we don't sit down and when we get together and talk about parenting very often. And we don't certainly talk about being men and being fathers. So these conversations for us don't happen a lot. I mean, I do understand that impulse of let's stop talking about our children. Let's stop talking about them. We talk about them too much, and talk about what is maybe more central.
Well, that's exactly
for
what I was
instance.
wondering. Maybe actually for you it's rare to have this opportunity to talk about father. And we shouldn't stop you from that. I just wondering.
No.
And how did you feel when you were invited to do this? I'm just amazed.
Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, to me, I find it the easiest thing in the world to talk about my work. I mean, I've been traveling for the last 2 months talking about my book, Reality Hunger. So I find it very, very easy to talk about my work, and I find it easy to talk about my work in relationship to fatherhood. For me, there was no conscious or concerted effort to say, okay. It was more just, I just thought, I was trying to sort of evacuate sort of artist as father. So I was trying, to me it's an easy gesture. Okay, let's talk about our daughters. Okay, I have a daughter. Now let me talk about my work. So I was sort of consciously sort of willing myself to not talk about my work and actually talk a little bit about fatherhood. So, I mean, it wasn't any particular strategy that Jay and I devised, other than the fact that I feel like that men sort of famously like to talk about themselves and their work, and so I felt it might be useful to not make that gesture, at least initially. That line, that famous joke, where enough, like a guy and a woman are at dinner. He goes, well, enough talking about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think about me? So I was trying to avoid that. I even have a book called "Enough About You" is the title of a recent book of mine. So,
David, do you have these conversations with other men about fatherhood? I mean, not like just a sides conversation either, but I mean,
Never, of course.
Yeah,
of course, never.
yeah. Yeah.
And I'm assuming when you go around and do readings and talk about your work, I say I'm assuming because from the typical perspective of a mother, I would be deliberately avoiding talking about that aspect of my life, perhaps as an attempt to present myself in a more professional way. So I wonder if that's your experience as well. But then my second question that I remembered is, you're sort of coming into a stage of your life where your daughter will be less of an impact time-wise and maybe not less of an influence, but I'm a few years ahead of you in that tradition.
Your children are grown, further out of the house.
My single child is now in college. And so I simultaneously experienced a feeling of like, oh, well, what now? But also a sort of, like the dam had burst and sort of this flood of possibilities. So I'm curious if you're not quite there yet, but maybe you can see it on the horizon.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I think. I think that I think in a previous book of mine, the thing about life is that One Day You'll Be Dead came out 2 years ago, and it deals overtly with my father and my daughter and my wife, and those people are figures in the book, and so inevitably, when I gave a reading from that book, people would ask me, how's your father doing? What's your daughter? How old is your daughter now? What does your wife think of the book? And things like that. It would kind of come up relatively naturally, although by no means at the center of the discussion. The core of that book is simply a meditation on mortality without the safety net of religion, and that's the core of that book. But in that book, it would come up relatively naturally from the material, whereas this recent book, say Reality Hunger, is this treatise about art, and so it just simply would be bizarre if that came up. It would just not really relevant in my view. I mean, it would be strange if that came up. And then as far as what happens when Natalie goes to college, who knows? One hears, that parents have to reinvent themselves, in the absence of this endless conversation piece called your child or children. And so, that my wife and I are fully aware of that and sort of trembling in our boots about that. But who knows? I can't really project that out. But sure, I think that'll be an interesting moment in our lives. And it'll be interesting how it affects my own creative work. So, I'm not sure what to say about that because just isn't here yet. What other questions or comments or arguments do people have? Anyone have any thoughts about either as a father or son or daughter or mother?
I'm finding this interesting that we're defining fatherhood, and it's really kind of trying to shoot at both of your experiences as writers, as fathers, are much different. The comments I've had with my friends when we talk about fatherhood is like, what happens in a generation? My father would come home, he'd have a beer, he'd read the paper, he was all when dinner was ready, he went back, he didn't have to worry about kids, he didn't have to worry about any of the chores, because his load was the provider. And then within a generation or two, society has determined that fathers must provide different roles. And so, what are the constants that you have found in your writings and in your own fatherhood that you have brought forward to become fathers from what you've learned? Because no one is born a father, no one is born a mother. It's like you were saying, a piece of you becomes alive when you have a child. What constants have you found that are true for all fathers that you can kind of agree with?
Wow. It's a biggie.
It's a big question. Well, I guess I can only think about my own particular experience. I think too, Linda, I'll just say that I think David and I are both a little confessional. We're sort of confessional types. Would you say that's right, David? So even as we're talking about this our art, we're, I think, constantly spilling into our lives. I would say with my particular experience, that the thing that feels constant, or that I got from my dad and that I saw in my grandfather, my dad's dad was a sort of openness to be present in this sort of in my son's life, and to be present in a way that is kind of not so much directive, but kind of peripheral or watching. I don't know, there's something about the way that I notice my dad watching me,
Watching over you?
No, watching me.
Not watching over you.
No, just witnessing my situation and appreciating it. That's something that he does more so now than he did when I was in my 20s. But I guess that's one thing I feel like I've carried over. But that's a really great question. I don't know. Just being there.
Yeah, being there.
In whatever way we can. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the question was it was a huge question. Obviously, one could write an entire book on it, and one can't answer that question in a couple of minutes. The question was, what constants are there as writers and artists, as a fatherhood, as a resource? I think for me, the connecting line is a kind of realness. That I was listening to a kind of an interesting radio show on the public radio station in Seattle a couple of days ago, ostensibly about nannies. I think about how oftentimes in certain families a nanny assumes an oddly important role, that the child or children are more forthcoming with the nannies sometimes than they are with the parents for a variety of reasons. So they asked this one nanny that she's apparently, they call her super, maybe there's even a TV show called Super Nanny. Haven't seen it. Super Nanny, it's a reality TV show. And so they were talking to the producer of the show they said, is the nanny really super nanny? He goes, yeah, she's amazing. They go, well, what makes her so good? And I believe the answer was something like that she's amazingly real with the kids. She just says, all those answers that you give to your parents, those are meaningless to me. I'm going to be completely real with you. I'm not going to put on a parental mask or an official mask of middle age, or a mask of your caregiver. I'm going to be weirdly real to you. And that kids, in her view, often, almost even always respond to that. That the super nanny, so-called, is just unusually, for lack of a better word, real with them. I'll be curious if anyone has seen the show. Some people seem to know the show. If you have seen it, I'd love to hear your take. But I think it's not a bad way to connect my writing and my role as a father, is that I do strive to be, again, and Natalie, if she were here, I'm sure she'd find me wanting in all kinds of ways, but that I do strive in my work to be just unusually candid, unusually, quote, real. The book is called Reality Hunger for a reason. And I think with Natalie, I just try to be, and a lot of her friends comment about that they said, your dad is not like a dad, he just does not play dad with you.
He doesn't play dad.
And it's like, and I value that. And I'm sure there are ways in which maybe she finds that frustrating, but I do think that is what connects up my writing and my living. and it is a resource. It's the way that parenthood has pushed me in, for lack of a better word, that's very real direction. Some people are nodding. Are some of you super nanny fans? If not, you can talk about something else.
So to kind of pick up on what the gentleman was talking about, I think that there's a concept of fatherness, right? You guys have talked about your experience of fatherness, but there's also like a cultural understanding about it. And I think that that really shapes us as we come into parents, into confronting what our parent is. And for me, my experience with having my daughter was that before I gave birth to her, literally right before I pushed her out into the world, I really related with children. And I had this idea of the kind of parent I was going to be because of that overarching concept, and also because my experience was as a child. But when I pushed her into the world, I confronted this trauma and this crisis because I was no longer a child at that moment. And I couldn't relate to her anymore as a child. I could only see myself as a parent, like almost in this weird way I had psychotically disconnected from myself and was now in my mother's place. And that has really shaped me as an artist. And I think also I'm really curious as an artist to know how other artists are shaped by their crises. And so I wanted to see if you felt like becoming a parent was a crisis, an identity crisis for you, or a trauma, and if that, how that has shaped your idea of fatherness and also your writing.
No, that's great.
That's a beautiful.
Very good.
It's a beautiful meditation. I think it's probably, alas, female. I mean, the degree to which you completely disconnected and became just. I mean, I do think. It would be preposterous for me to claim as a father that the degree of trauma and transformation was as complete. I mean, to me, it was a relatively substantial change in my personality. But hearing you, I couldn't help but feeling, maybe with a certain envy even, the degree or admiration or something that you're like, wow, that's...
Envy? Did you say envy?
Well, in a way. I mean, just it's, it's a more profound transformation. That is my first impulse. That the transformation, in my view, was, was not as, to use your words, as psychotic. Psychotic in the best sense. But that's my impulse. Other men, of course, would have a different view. But don't know if Jay wants to jump in or if we want to get to some other questions. But.
I don't think, and George, I totally understand what you're getting at. I don't, like having a son wasn't necessarily a crisis. It was very difficult at the time, but I didn't quite know it either, But I like the idea of, the identity, crisis of identity, then spilling out in shaping art. And for me, it was actually marriage. That my identity within a marriage became, I became very dislocated, and it in turn then began to form my art or my writing. But I do like that notion that we sort of, an identity crisis gives rise to, organizing this material we have, Yeah. Aaron?
Yeah, this might be a little bit of a redundant question because we've already kind of talked about how fatherhood has shaped your writing. I'm just wondering if fatherhood has changed or shaped how or why you read as well.
Not what you're writing.
How you're reading, why you're reading.
Other books are there.
Maybe what you're reading, too.
I guess I've become more interested in I mean, I've always been interested in father and son stories, but I don't necessarily, and I've become maybe a little more interested, but I also don't necessarily pick my reading because of certain subject matters. Like, it's usually more, like, I'm kind of become more interested in forms and voices and various kinds of writing that I gravitate towards, not so much a particular subject matter. But I don't know, that's a good question. I mean, I definitely, in similar ways to writing, I've become more interested in brevity as a form.
Because of time.
But I've compromised my writing time more so than my reading time as a parent. You know, it's my reading time has probably stayed about the same, whereas my writing time has decreased a little. I don't know. That's a good question, Aaron.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question. I think it's affected a lot how and what and why I've read, and I think in turn, of course, what one reads hugely influences what one writes, and I think it changed what I've read. I'll see if I can articulate that. Well, a little bit of this, I'm stealing a little bit of thunder from my talk tonight, so I don't know how many of you are going to go to my reading. Is it this afternoon or like at 5 or something like that?
There's a reading at 7. 7, yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
At Villa Maria, which is right over here. Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, I think the way that I would say it is I almost exclusively now read work that overtly wrestles with the question of the writer trying to solve, let me back up a bit. An interview that David Foster Wallace gave many years ago, he was asked, what's so great about writing? And he said, well, we're existentially alone on the planet. You can't know what I'm thinking and feeling, and I can't know what you're thinking and feeling. And writing at its best is a bridge constructed across the abyss of human loneliness. That, I think, is a great answer, and it is, to me, the answer. It's why writing matters. And the work that I love, the work that I exclusively try to write, the work I teach, the work that I read, puts at the center of the work how the writer solved being alive. It tries to actually address that question of, it actually tries overtly to construct a bridge across human loneliness. And so that sort of reading a novel because it's sort of a rip-roaring tale or something like that, it literally doesn't interest me. I mean, I can literally not read it. And part of the reason that a book like Reality Hunger has been somewhat controversial, this book of mine that was published a couple months ago, is that it's been arguing against work like that. It's understood to be sort of saying, which it's not, it's that the novel is dead. And I'm almost exclusively interested in work that's unbelievably emotionally serious and, you might say, ontologically or epistemologically serious. It's trying to wrestle with the most serious questions of human existence. So, and I have this reading list that I call Very Partial Reading List, which is up on both my website and on my Facebook page if you want to see the list of many books that I think do this. So I think, again, I do think it's really influenced my reading in that way. And also, in turn, that reading has influenced my writing. It's a really interesting question, I think. Of course, Natalie's taste is for the Twilight series and for, Harry Potter. And so, she can't stand the books I love. But that's not the point exactly. What other questions?
Yeah, we should have one more question,
more
and then we should close our discussion. Go ahead.
Do you find that you have, that you think of your children when you're writing as audience, and does that allow for a certain level of self-censorship that you maybe didn't have before you were a parent, or do you not even think about your kids? You block them out of that?
Rephrase the question, or put it so I can understand what she's asking.
She's asking if when we write, if we consider and feel free to correct me, if we consider our kids as potentially an audience for the work, and an audience, like somebody who might be a reader of the work, and if that somehow then affects the process. And I would definitely say I don't at all consider that when I'm writing, that I really try to shut that out and speak very honestly, and not worry at all about that. Someday he will probably read it, but yeah. David?
Yeah, ditto. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it is complicated, isn't it, where, with the web now, that Natalie's, this previous book of mine, The Thing About Life is That One Day You'll Be Dead, has all sorts of intimate physical details about my body, about my wife's body, even a little bit about Natalie's body. And there was a review that she wanted to look up of the book. I don't think she's read any of my books. And, and she reads, it's not like she doesn't read, she reads, Jane Austen, and she reads Emily Bronte, and, she's not like she's not a reader, but I've heard quite over and over and over from many writers that there's some very deep thing in children that you don't want to read your parents' work, which is fascinating. I guess you don't want to see them as completely real. They actually have emotional lives. Is apparently somewhat off-putting to children. So I would agree with Jay, of course, that in order to write really good work, you have to be really invested in not censoring yourself because of what you'll think, what your parents will think, what your sister will think, what your daughter will think. But I am aware of Natalie. She is older than Oscar, of course, so that she might actually read this stuff. I remember she was once trying to look up this review of my book, and instead she came across this article that was full of all these intimate details about my body. It's like, whoa, I do not want to read this. And then she said, what if my kids see this? And not her kid, that's an interesting Freudian slip. What if her friends see this? And I'm, on the one hand, as a parent, I could say, I'm sorry about that. But there's a much stronger part of me that's a writer who just says, that's none of your business. I have to override that. It's hard to write a book, it's very hard to write a good book, and it's impossible to write a good book if you're concerned with how your intimates are going to judge it. I learned a long time ago that the people who you most want to love your work won't. That people who know you the best are always going to view it through the scrim of their own needs, as do I when I read myself and other people's work. They're never going to read it on the terms in which it's meant. So I've long ago given up on that idea. And so I'm aware that it's a very complicated issue, but I do strive quite hard to overwrite any such self-censorship.
So I just wanted to thank David for being a part of this conversation, and Linda also for coming and sharing your work, and Terry for hosting us.